In the spring of 2009, 750,000 tickets disappeared in 4 hours. A man who hadn't toured in 12 years announced 50 concerts in London. The demand was so enormous, the ticket sites crashed under the weight of it. People sat refreshing their screens for hours just to buy a single seat. He was 50 years old. He called it his final curtain call. He was 18 days away from the first show when everything stopped. This was a man who'd been famous since before most kids finish elementary school. He sold more records than almost anyone who has ever lived. His music pulled together millions of people who shared nothing else in common. And yet, the people closest to him kept saying the same strange thing. He was lonely. Surrounded by the attention of the entire planet, he felt completely alone. His face changed over the years. His story splintered into 100 versions. The tabloids invented a man he almost never bothered to correct. More than a decade later, we're still arguing about who he actually was. So here's the question this whole story turns on. How did the most famous entertainer in history spend his entire life searching for one simple thing that all of that fame could never give him? By the end of this video, you'll understand why the king of pop kept chasing a childhood he never got to live. And once you see that, everything else about him finally starts to make sense. It begins with a little boy in a steel town being taught to perform like a grown man. Michael Joseph Jackson was born on August 29, 1958 in Gary, Indiana. Gary was a factory city built around steel. His father, Joseph, worked as a crane operator at the mill and played blues guitar in local clubs at night. There were 9 children in that small house. Michael was one of the youngest, and by the time he was 5 years old, his father had discovered something that would change all of their lives. The boy could sing, not the way children sing. He could carry a room. Joseph pulled his sons into a group, Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and little Michael out front. And then the rehearsals began. Here's where the myth and the reality start to pull apart. To the outside world, this was a charming family act. Behind the door, it was work, long hours, strict discipline, a father who demanded perfection and didn't always ask nicely. Michael would later describe a childhood that skipped most of the parts that make you a child. While other kids played outside, he rehearsed. While other kids made mistakes, he was expected to be flawless on cue. Think about that for a second. The talent everyone admired was built on a childhood he was quietly losing. He was performing in nightclubs before he was old enough to understand what a nightclub was. And it worked. The act got tighter, the little boy got sharper, and soon the whole country would know his name. But the sacrifice behind that talent? Almost nobody saw it. The brothers played talent shows. They worked the rough touring circuit, the string of clubs and theaters that black performers traveled in that era. Some of those venues were places a child should never have seen. Michael watched grown entertainers, studied them, absorbed everything, and carried it back on stage the same night. They won a legendary amateur competition at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. For a group of kids from a steel town, that was a dream most people never touch. And it put them on a path that would only accelerate. Here's the thing to hold on to. Every step forward was also a step further from a normal life. The applause grew. The workload grew. The childhood shrank. And Michael, the one out front, felt all of it most. Their reputation kept building until it reached the one company that could turn them into stars. Motown Records, the most important label in black music, run by a man named Berry Gordy. The story goes that Gordy wasn't even interested at first. The act seemed too young. But someone filmed the brothers performing, and when Gordy watched the tape, he changed his mind completely. In 1969, he signed the Jackson 5. The family relocated to Los Angeles. Motown built a machine around them, a dedicated team of songwriters, a grooming operation for stardom. Even Diana Ross was brought in to help introduce them to the world. Then came the song that started everything. I Want You Back was released in October 1969, and it detonated. Then ABC, then The Love You Save, then I'll Be There. 4 singles in a row, all #1. Understand how rare that is. The Jackson 5 became the first act in history to send their first 4 charting singles straight to the top. No group had ever done it. To the audience, it looked effortless. 5 smiling brothers in bright clothes, moving in perfect sync, led by a boy with a voice that seemed impossible for his age. The fame came fast, and it came huge. There was a Jackson 5 cartoon on Saturday mornings. There were magazine covers and screaming crowds. Michael became a teen idol before he was even a teenager. He was, in every real sense, a child superstar. But the pressure didn't ease with success. It multiplied. Every hit raised the bar for the next one. The machine needed to be fed, and the child at the center of it was carrying the weight of the whole family on his shoulders. Behind the scenes, cracks were forming. The family wanted more creative control over their own music. Motown wanted to keep control of the formula. That tension kept building until, in 1976, the brothers walked away from the label that made them. Jermaine stayed behind. The rest reformed under a new deal, now simply called the Jacksons. But the real shift wasn't about a record contract. The world had fallen in love with the little brother out front, and the little brother was starting to realize something dangerous. He didn't need the group anymore. He could do this alone. Leaving your family's group is a risk, but that wasn't the biggest gamble Michael Jackson would take. In 1979, he released his first major solo album as an adult. It was called Off the Wall, and he made it with a producer named Quincy Jones. The two of them had met while working on a film, and something clicked. Jones brought polish and patience. Michael brought a hunger that never switched off. Off the Wall was a smash. By 1980, it had become the best-selling album ever recorded by a black artist. It produced hit after hit, and it announced that the child star had grown into something new, but it also stung him. That year, the album was largely overlooked at the Grammy Awards. Friends said the snub lit a fire in him. He decided the next album wouldn't just win, it would be undeniable. For almost any performer alive, Off the Wall would have been the peak, a career-defining triumph. Time to relax. Michael Jackson looked at that success and decided it wasn't enough. He told people he wanted to make the biggest album in the history of the world. Not a hit, the biggest. And in late 1982, he did it. The album was Thriller, and nothing in pop music has ever caught up to it. The numbers are hard to even picture. 7 of its songs became top 10 singles. It sat at number 1 for 37 weeks. It's still, by most estimates, the best-selling album of all time, with well over 60 million copies sold around the globe. At the Grammy Awards, he walked away with 8 trophies in a single night. It had never been done before, and it set a record that stood for years. One man, one evening, 8 awards. For a moment, he was the most celebrated performer alive by every measurable standard. Records shattered, critics stunned, an entire industry reorganizing itself around a single artist. If fame could ever fill the hole left by a lost childhood, this was the moment it should have happened. It didn't. And that quiet failure is the thread that runs through everything that came next. But sales figures don't explain what really happened, because Thriller wasn't just heard, it was watched. The music video for the title track ran nearly 14 minutes. It was a short horror film with zombies, directed like a Hollywood movie. When it premiered on MTV, people scheduled their evenings around it. A music video had become an event. And there's a piece of this that's easy to forget now. In its early days, MTV rarely played black artists. Michael's videos helped shatter that wall. The channel that had mostly ignored people who looked like him now revolved around him. He didn't just cross the color line on television, he erased it, one video at a time. That's part of why Thriller mattered beyond the sales. It rewired the culture. It made pop music global, visual, and impossible to ignore. And then there was one night that turned him from a star into a legend. In the spring of 1983, Michael performed on a television special celebrating Motown. He sang Billie Jean, and during the bridge of the song, he did something almost no one had seen before. He glided backwards across the stage while appearing to walk forwards. The Moonwalk. The real move lasted about 2.5 seconds. 2.5 seconds that people still talk about today. Here's the part almost nobody knows. Michael went backstage afterward and cried. He was convinced he'd done a terrible job. He thought he'd failed. Then, on his way out, a little boy stopped him and told him he was amazing. And that, Michael said, was the first moment he believed he'd done well. Because in his words, children don't lie. Stop and sit with that. The most electric performer on the planet needed a child to tell him he was good enough. The next day, the legendary dancer Fred Astaire called him personally to praise the performance. 50 million people had watched. The world couldn't stop staring at Michael Jackson, and neither could the tabloids. Now he had a problem that success created, and it was one he couldn't fix. The bigger Michael Jackson got, the smaller his ordinary life became. He couldn't walk into a store. He couldn't sit in a park. Fame this large is a kind of cage, and he was locked inside it. So he kept doing the only thing that had ever brought him love. He kept reinventing himself. In 1987, he released Bad. Following the biggest album of all time is a nearly impossible task. And yet, Bad delivered a run of #1 singles and became a giant in its own right. He took it on the road for his first solo world tour, playing to sold-out stadiums across the planet. Then came Dangerous in 1991, pushing his sound into a harder, sharper, more modern direction. He kept moving. He refused to stand still or repeat himself. On stage, he was untouchable. The choreography got more complex. The illusions got bolder. The performances stopped feeling like concerts and started feeling like events you'd remember for the rest of your life. In 1993, he played the Super Bowl halftime show and turned a football broadcast into a global concert, changing what that halftime slot could even be. Away from the stage, he poured money and time into humanitarian work. He gave to children's causes across the world. The child who never got a childhood seemed drawn over and over to protecting the childhoods of others. But here's the pattern that starts to emerge. Every time he reinvented his music, the public reinvented their image of him too. And their version was getting stranger than the truth, because his appearance was changing, and the world decided it had the right to an explanation. The headlines were about to get louder than the music. This is the part of the story people think they understand. Usually they don't. By the late 1980s, Michael Jackson's skin was visibly lighter. The tabloids ran wild with theories. The cruelest one accused him of trying to erase his own race, of turning his back on where he came from. Then, in 1993, he sat down with Oprah Winfrey and told the truth on live television. He had a disease called vitiligo. It destroys the pigment in the skin, in blotches, and it can't be controlled. His dermatologist had reportedly diagnosed it years earlier. To even out the uneven patches, he used a depigmenting treatment. That's what lightened his skin. And in that same interview, he said something the tabloids had ignored for years. He was proud to be a Black American, proud of his race, proud of who he was. Years later, his autopsy report would confirm it. The vitiligo was real. But the truth arrived far too late to catch the rumors. People had already decided. Even after his death, some still refused to believe him. Then there was Neverland, the ranch he built in California, complete with a zoo and amusement rides. To some, it was proof he'd lost touch with reality. But look at it through the lens of this whole story, and another reading appears. A man who never got to be a kid built himself a place where he could finally be one. He filled it with the things a childhood is supposed to have and never gave him. Whether that was healthy or heartbreaking, people still argue, but it fits the pattern exactly. And the changing face fed the same machine. Every new photograph became a headline. Every headline became a joke or a theory or an accusation. The more the public stared, the less they actually saw. They were looking at a symbol they'd invented, not the person underneath it. The public kept writing new chapters of his life for him, and Michael, strangely, almost never fought back. He rarely explained himself. He let the silence fill with other people's stories. That silence was about to cost him more than he could imagine, because his hardest years were still ahead. Now we reach the years that nearly ended everything. In 1993, Michael Jackson was accused of child molestation. The claim shook his career to its foundation. That first case never went to a criminal trial. It was reportedly settled. But the accusation attached itself to his name and never fully let go. Then, in 2005, it happened again. This time, it went all the way to a courtroom in California. 10 criminal charges, a trial that ran for 4 months and became a global spectacle. This is where I have to be careful and precise because the facts matter here more than opinions. The prosecution painted one portrait of Michael Jackson. The defense painted the opposite, arguing the accusers were after his money. Celebrities took the witness stand. The media coverage was relentless, and much of it treated him as guilty before a verdict existed. On June 13, 2005, the jury reached its decision, not guilty, on all 10 counts. Legally, that's the record. He was acquitted of everything. That is a fact, and it deserves to be stated plainly. But here's the honest complication. A verdict ended the trial. It didn't end the debate. Years after his death, one man who had testified in Michael's defense changed his account and filed a lawsuit alleging abuse. Others have defended Michael fiercely, pointing to the acquittal and the lack of a conviction. The truth is, the public never reached a verdict of its own. People chose sides then, and they hold those sides now. This story won't tell you which side is right. It can only tell you what the court decided and what remained unsettled. What isn't in doubt is the toll it took. The trial dragged on for 4 months, and it drained him completely. He lost weight. He looked hollowed out and exhausted. There were days he arrived at court barely able to stand. The most famous performer in the world was now fighting just to hold on to his own name. And the coverage was merciless. Cameras tracked his every move. Comedians built entire routines around him. Whatever the verdict would be, the spectacle had already rewritten him in the public mind. That's the cruel part. A courtroom can clear you of charges. It can't erase the years of headlines that came first. When it was finally over, he didn't celebrate. He left. He never lived at Neverland again, the storybook home that had come to symbolize everything, good and bad, about his life. He drifted, spending long stretches in Bahrain and Ireland, far from the country that had put him on trial. He was a global icon in self-imposed exile, and many people believed his career was finished for good. But Michael Jackson wasn't thinking about the past. He was quietly planning a beginning. In the years after the trial, he pulled back from the spotlight. He focused on the 3 things that seemed to keep him steady: his children, Prince, Paris, and his youngest. For all the noise around his life, the people who knew him described a devoted, hands-on father. He read to them. He taught them. He shielded them from the cameras, sometimes covering their faces in public, which drew its own wave of mockery. But look closer at that choice through the lens of this whole story. Here was a man whose own face had been sold to the world since he was 5 years old. Of course he wanted to hide his children's. He was trying to give them the one thing he'd never had: a private, protected childhood, anonymity, the freedom to just be kids. It's one of the clearest windows into who he really was. The child who lost everything to fame spent his last years trying to make sure his own children wouldn't. And slowly, creatively, he started to stir again. There were ideas for new projects, films, music, a vision for something bigger than a comeback. Because he didn't want to relive his old glory. Friends said he wanted something different. One more beginning, a fresh chapter on his own terms after everything the world had thrown at him. He was in his late 40s now. The voice was still there, the instinct was still there, and a plan was forming that could put him back on top of the world. Then came the announcement millions of people had been waiting more than a decade to hear. On March 5, 2009, Michael Jackson stood at a press conference at the O2 Arena in London and told the world he was coming back. Millions believed this would be the greatest comeback in music history. The plan started as 10 shows, but the demand was so violent that it exploded to 50. Over 750,000 tickets sold in about 4 hours. More than 1 million people had registered, wanting in. It would have been one of the biggest live events ever staged. He called it "This Is It," his final series of concerts, his last word. Think about what that comeback meant to him. He hadn't done a major tour since the late 1990s. More than a decade of silence, of scandal, of exile. And now the world was telling him, in the loudest way possible, that it still wanted him. That kind of proof, for a man who spent his whole life needing to hear he was enough, must have meant everything. The rehearsals were captured on film, more than 100 hours of it. And when you watch that footage today, something jumps out. He looks incredible. He dances, he sings, he jokes with the crew. On the good nights, the king of pop was still very much the king of pop. But there was another side to those weeks. His health, both physical and mental, was fragile. He struggled with sleep. He carried the enormous pressure of proving, at 50, that he could still be the greatest. There was a whole life waiting on the far side of those London shows. People close to him described plans for more tours, a reunion with his brothers so their mother could see them perform together one last time, even dreams of building a children's hospital. The dream looked like it was finally within reach, but time was quietly running out, and no one knew how little of it was left. The next morning would stop the world cold. On the night of June 24, 2009, Michael Jackson rehearsed at a Los Angeles arena. Witnesses said he was in good spirits. He sang, he danced, he went home after midnight. He'd struggled with insomnia for years. To help him sleep that night, his personal physician, a doctor named Conrad Murray, gave him a powerful surgical anesthetic called propofol, along with other sedatives. It was a drug never meant to be used that way. Not in a bedroom, not to fall asleep. Michael Jackson never woke up. On June 25, 2009, he was found unresponsive. His pulse was weak, then gone. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, and at 2:26 in the afternoon, the most famous entertainer on earth was pronounced dead. He was 50 years old, 18 days before his comeback. The news moved across the planet almost instantly. Websites buckled under the traffic. Phone networks jammed. In city after city, strangers stopped and gathered because it didn't feel real. The coroner later ruled his death a homicide, caused by that lethal dose of propofol. Dr. Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. He served 2 years of his sentence. Then came a strange, haunting footnote. All that rehearsal footage, over 100 hours of a comeback that never happened, was turned into a documentary film. It was called This Is It. Millions went to theaters to watch a concert that would never take place, performed by a man who was already gone. It became one of the highest-grossing concert films ever made. The saddest performance of his career was the one you could only see after he died. On July 7, 2009, a public memorial was held in Los Angeles. It was broadcast around the world to an audience measured in the hundreds of millions, one of the most watched events of its kind ever. Fellow artists sang, old friends spoke. A gold casket sat at the front of the arena. And then his young daughter Paris stepped to the microphone. Through tears, she said that her daddy was the best father you could ever imagine. For a family that had spent years hidden behind veils and masks, it was the first time the world truly heard from one of his children. It's the kind of moment that reframes everything you thought you knew. Because in that instant, the strange headlines and the tabloid theories fell away. What was left was a man, a father, someone's child. The person finally visible underneath the legend the world had built on top of him. His final performance never happened, and somehow, in death, his legacy grew even larger than it had been in life. Maybe, all along, the world had been misunderstanding him. So why does Michael Jackson still matter, all these years later? Start with the obvious. He changed what music could sound like, and he changed what a performance could look like. The moonwalk. The choreography, the idea that a music video could be a film. Modern pop is still built on the foundation he poured. Listen to almost any major artist who followed. The staging, the dancing, the ambition, the blending of genres. So much of it traces back to him. He kicked open doors, especially on television and radio, that had been closed to black artists before him. Generations of stars have openly called him the reason they do what they do. He was also a genuine humanitarian on a massive scale. He raised money for causes across the world and gave enormous sums to charity. For all the strangeness the tabloids attached to him, the impulse to help, especially to help children, ran through his entire adult life. And here we reach the hardest part of his legacy, the part no honest telling can skip. For some people, the allegations will always shadow the music. For others, the acquittal and the lack of a conviction settle the matter. Millions have wrestled with the same uncomfortable question. Can you separate the art from the artist? This story can't answer that for you. It can only be honest that the question exists and that reasonable people land on opposite sides of it. What no one disputes is the reach of the work itself, and the music refused to fade. In the streaming era, a whole generation that never saw him perform live found him anyway. Billie Jean, Thriller, Beat It. The songs kept finding new ears, decade after decade, played by people who weren't even born when he died. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, once with his brothers, once on his own. He won 13 Grammy Awards. The numbers are staggering. But by now you know the numbers were never the real story. Michael Jackson didn't just entertain the world, he permanently expanded what a single performer could be. And that brings us back to where we started, to the boy in Gary, Indiana, rehearsing in a small house while other children played outside. Michael Jackson spent almost his entire life on a stage. He inspired generations. He reinvented music and dance and the whole idea of celebrity. He gave the world more than almost any performer ever has. Yet behind all of it, the story keeps returning to something much smaller and much simpler. A person who was searching for peace, for understanding, for a childhood he never actually got to have. Remember the Moonwalk, the most dazzling moment of his career, and afterward he cried backstage, certain he'd failed, until a child told him he was good enough. That's the whole story in a single image. A man who could move millions, still waiting to hear that he was enough. He spent his life giving the world unforgettable performances, and spent it quietly hoping someone would tell him the boy from Gary had done a good job. Perhaps that's why his story still holds us. Not because he became the king of pop, but because behind one of the most extraordinary careers in human history, there was a person trying to find happiness in a life that no one else has ever lived. He named his final act, "This Is It." Maybe, in a way none of us expected, it always was.